Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we try to turn you on to great theories and discoveries that you probably wouldn't hear elsewhere. But if you did, they would change your life in profound ways. And lately we've been doing a lot of decodes of Bible decodes of the New Testament. I believe today is number 188. And most of them have been either looking into how the Dead Sea Scrolls could help with your interpretation, and also the Roman origins hypothesis, which is how the New Testament was written by the Romans. The Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, between 69 and 96 AD. And the theory is that they wrote the Gospels mainly for the purposes of trying to pacify the Jews, who they had just gotten done defeating in a war. But they knew that that wasn't long lived because they had defeated the Jews in several other wars and insurrections and revolts that the Jews were constantly having against the Romans ever since the Romans had come into Judea in 63 BC. So over 100 years of this, and Vespasian and Titus were both, before they became emperors, they were both military generals in the war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. They wrote the Gospels, and at the same time they wrote a history of this war called the Jewish War, and they put that out under the name of Josephus. And if you examine the two side by side, you will and you have an open mind and a mind that is informed about what you're looking for, because a lot of this stuff is well hidden, but once you see it, you can't really unsee it. You will see parallel after parallel after parallel between the two, and a lot of there are like many different patterns or many different families of parallels. The biggest one was probably discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, where he looked at the book of Luke and War of the Jews and found a series of about 40 or 45 consecutive parallels between the ministry of Jesus in Judea and the military campaign of Titus in Judea. And every place that Titus goes, documented in War of the Jews, are the same places that Jesus goes in the Gospels. And they go to these places in the same order, and they encounter parallel events. Not the same event, but the same type of event, or an analogous event. And then these events are spaced by 40 years, because they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 plus years, and then they wrote War of the Jews, which was a more contemporary thing, just going back a couple years. And again, that's like over 40 consecutive events in the same order. Then Michael Menescot's, in his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, also dug out over 250 parallels in just the book of Luke. The book of Luke is In your Bible, the book of Luke is like 17 pages long or something like that. That means there's like 16 parallels on every page. So maybe 15. We'll just say 15 parallels on every page, meaning that the parallels really just saturate the book of Luke. And some of them are incredibly detailed, particular, well hidden, and well thought out. Some of them are more just, maybe only have 2 or 3 common motifs between each other. Some of them have like a dozen motifs between each other. You read the passage and you're like, well, this is in common, this is in common, this is in common, this is in common. So we're going to actually go through all of those one by one. We really have already done that going through Menescott's book, but I think it'll be more pronounced if we do it as we go through the book of Luke. Just because War of the Jews is about 40 times longer. That's just an estimate, but War of the Jews is about 40 times longer than the book of Luke. So when you go through the book of Luke, you will see just how many there actually are. Say if the book of Luke is 17 pages, that makes the War of the Jews like 680, 700 pages, and 250 parallels spread out over 750 pages is just like one per 2.8 pages, as opposed to 15 per page. So it's a lot more a lot more oomph if you do it going through the book of Luke. And there will be other decodes as well. The Roman origins hypothesis is not the only way to decode this. You can also use a Dead Sea Scrolls perspective. You can use mythological, astrological perspectives, and several other kind of ciphers. Also like the copying, plagiarism from both the Old Testament and other religious documents. Okay, now what we're doing today again is we first went over a book of Christian apologetics called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and we showed how he is trying to make the case for Christ by interviewing many experts in the field and stating the case, but he unintentionally actually makes the case for Caesar better than he makes the case for Christ. A lot of times the arguments are arguments in absentia, or well, there is no other way. Well, there's no other way you could explain it but a supernatural occurrence. But if you have the Roman origins hypothesis and you recognize that the Romans made up this story as a form of psychological warfare against the Jews, a psyop, then it starts to make sense logically, with no resort to supernatural occurrences. Now we're looking at a book called Nailed by David Fitzgerald, who is a more of an atheist perspective, where he's trying to expose 10 myths that Christians use to convince you that they have more evidence than they really do. And he is also hampered by the fact that he doesn't know about the Roman origins hypothesis. And so we're going over that. The part that, the myth that he's covering right now is that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are in agreement with their assessment of Jesus. And I think that's pretty clear that John is not really part of the same fabric as the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But even so, he points out a lot of discrepancies between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Even though Matthew is over 91% copied from Mark, and Luke is like 55% copied from Mark. And then Luke copies Matthew a little bit as well. John is kind of out there, and this is where he's discussing the book of John and how John makes Jesus very much like the personification of control and being in total control, always being in charge, even when he's being taken to the cross and put on the cross. He, doesn't show any weaknesses or anything like that. So, I and the Father are one. Mark 10:30. John 10:30. John's Jesus is not born of a virgin. He matter-of-factly states that Jesus is Joseph's son without comment in John 1:45. Other Gospels, which say that it lasted only about a year, took place. This is Jesus' ministry. Apparently, John is the only one of Jesus, only one to have a 3-year ministry for Jesus. I'm not sure about that, but I'll have to look into that, because that would kind of affect Atwill's hypothesis. But the thing is that is great about both of these books, and there are many other books that present the Roman origins hypothesis as well, but that you don't have to take their word for it. You can verify it for yourself. You can get yourself a copy of Josephus online as a PDF and go through it with your Bible, with your book of Luke right next to your computer or whatever, and just compare for yourself. You can, there may be, if you're aided by these other books, they might be able to help you with a few of the decodes by giving you background information that maybe you don't know, but most people back then would have known, because doubtless the Romans were sharing. They were into ridicule and mockery, and so that a lot of that is in this in these decodes, in this psyop against the Jews. And I believe that they just kind of spread this out among the court at Rome, including Josephus and whoever else, whoever really wrote that, whether it was really Josephus or a team of people or whatever. They all just kind of laughed about the various stories that they were making up. Okay. So there's a lot of inside jokes. Menescot's, in fact, said, I found over 250 plus parallels, but who knows how many more there were. And also what Menescot's does is he graphs out the parallels that he found, and puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and plots a point every place he finds a parallel. And he, after plotting the 250 plus points, he found that he has made 5 perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royals. And obviously the Gospels and Josephus are both written in Greek, which was the language of Rome at the time. All of the Roman royals spoke Greek as well as Latin, whereas in Judea they were speaking Aramaic and hardly writing at all. But Greek existed in Judea, but it just wasn't nearly as common as it was in Rome. and also considered that the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, and on distribution. They had also a very clear modus operandus that they used for their psyops. They created a number of other religions also in the first century for the purposes of psychological warfare against the Jews and others. Now, he says John's Jesus has an entirely different speaking style. He gives no parables, no snappy cynic-style comebacks, no Sermon on the Mount like Matthew, or Sermon on the Plain like Luke. And so no Beatitudes, no blessed are the meek, no love thy neighbor, no suffer little children, no consider the lilies of the field, no turn the other cheek. The poor and the suffering may be the focus of his ministry in the other Gospels, but they barely get a mention from John's Jesus. And who else does John's Jesus hate besides liberals? The Jews. So, I don't know why he brings in the kind of 20th century categories of political orientation, but that's the basic idea throughout the Gospels, not just in John, but increasingly in John. John was considered to be the final gospel by quite a bit, maybe written all the way into the 2nd century, whereas Mark was probably in the 70s, and Matthew and Luke probably in the 80s AD. But they become kind of increasingly more pro-Roman and anti-Jewish as they go along. But even in all 4 of the Gospels, you can never find Jesus doing anything anti-Roman. But you can see him doing a ton of things that are anti-Jewish, especially, overturning the tables of the money changers and, going after the animal salesman, the Jewish animal salesman outside the temple. And then blaming the Jews for, the retaliation or going after him. So the Gospels reads exactly as if it were written by the Romans. It's not any type of stretch. And many scholars have figured this out who aren't even, in the Roman origins hypothesis. They're like, why is Jesus so pro-Roman? And then Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. We're going to go over a book at some point here in the near future called Operation Messiah by Thies van Vaskillen and Rosemary Sheldon that actually uses the thesis that Paul is a Roman intelligence agent. So it's taking it's not exactly going with the Roman origins hypothesis, but it is clearly recognizing that there's something very fishy going on, and so they accuse Paul of being a spy for the Romans, and that his conversion on the road to Damascus was complete theater, and which makes sense because do you think that the Romans were just going to let Paul defect from being an employee of the Romans, and all of a sudden he gets convinced that Jesus is actually good, and so now he's he has to quit. He has to quit his job of persecuting Christians or whatever, really persecuting Jewish zealots. And so we'll look at that, and we'll see how that is illuminated by the Roman origins hypothesis as well. But okay, so He's talking about the Passover here, Passover lamb. John describes himself as the living bread and outrages his Jewish audience by insisting they eat his flesh and drink his blood in John 6:51 through 58. Though Luke tells us 6 times that the Last Supper is a Passover Seder, he even has Jesus explicitly say so. John contradicts this completely. His Jesus doesn't have a Last Supper of a Passover lamb. He is the Passover lamb, which is also very interesting if you read Josephus and the War of the Jews and the story of the Passover lamb in there, where a mother named Mary is beset by the siege of Jerusalem and is starving to death and decides to take her infant son and roast him just like a Passover lamb. It's very comparable to especially the passage in John 11, I believe, where they're making Lazarus a supper. Both of those are winks at cannibalism. The story in Josephus is overt cannibalism. The story in the Gospels is a wink at cannibalism, where they make Lazarus a supper just after he is resurrected by Jesus from the tomb after being dead for 4 days. He's not resurrected, he's still dead. They're having him for supper. Okay, so back to John. Jesus laughs scornfully and says, "Bring it on. Shall I not drink the cup which the Father has given me?" He even seems to be openly mocking the suffering Jesuses in the other Gospels. That's John 18:11. And then once we get to the Passion story, he says even John is copying from Mark at that point. So I didn't realize that either. And the whole date for the John resurrection is different than, or at least the crucifixion is different. As it's on Passover Eve rather than on Passover. And he says the scholars of John believe it's because he wishes to play up the symbolism between the slaughter of Jesus and the slaughter of Passover lambs. Matthew, many places, takes an omniscient point of view where he somehow knows something that he doesn't have any reason to know. Like the various secret meetings of Jesus' enemies in Matthew 26 too. And also things like what angels say to Joseph in his dreams in Matthew 1 and parts of Matthew 2. And the motives for Judas betraying Jesus. I think Mark gets in on it there as well in Mark 14:10, and talks about petty theft, possession by Satan. Luke and John even claim to know the exact moment when Satan enters Judas's heart, even though they disagree about when that was. Okay. Now, I think the next myth is that the Gospels were writing as historians. He says Luke was acting as a historical novelist, not a historical reporter. He stole the basic story outline, often in an identical language, from Mark, and then he enthusiastically mines the work of Josephus and others. So many historians have noted the comparisons between the book of Luke and War of the Jews by Josephus, but they haven't added up 2 and 2 to actually go to the level of actually whoever Josephus was also wrote Luke and the rest of the synoptics too. And John was most likely written in a later period, maybe by a later emperor, maybe by Domitian, Titus's younger brother, or perhaps by Titus. Whoever is the court historian or the writer for Titus or Domitian, I don't think that they did it themselves, but just is emanating from the court of Rome. I think that's a lot of what's happened, and what makes it easy to dismiss the Roman origins hypothesis is that you can't really determine which Roman it was. Was it Josephus? Was it Titus? Was it Arius Peso? Or was it, Tiberius Alexander and Berenike? Or was it, the whole family of the Pesos? So it's hard to pin that down, but it doesn't matter which one it was. The main point is that it's emanating from Rome. Regardless of which Roman wrote it, the comparisons between and the parallels between the two just mean that whichever Roman wrote Josephus is also the same Roman that wrote the Gospels. It doesn't matter which one it is. I mean, it would be great to figure that out, but it doesn't destroy the hypothesis to destroy, say that Josephus wrote it, or say that Peso wrote it. Okay, so now Luke mining Josephus and others, including Homer and Euripides, for historic details, geographical notes, and famous individuals he could insert into his story in order to give the whole work an air of authenticity. Luke's defenders today still latch onto these little snippets of historical detail and triumphantly hold them up as proof of his incredible accuracy, conveniently ignoring his mistakes and outright falsehoods, such as when he goes too far and includes historical details that are extremely dubious, if not outright impossible, such as Paul meeting Agrippa and Berenike, who were, I believe, those two were brother and sister, and they were having a fling, an incestuous affair. I think that's Agrippa. I would guess that would be Agrippa the First, but it seems, I don't know. An event that Agrippa's close friend Josephus would certainly have mentioned if true, or anachronistic events that actually happened long after the time he claims they did, such as those described in Gamaliel's, if that's how you pronounce it, speech in Acts 5:34-37. The situation with Agrippa and Berenike, that's in Acts 25:23. Luke also betrays unfamiliarity with basic facts of Judaism and Palestinian geography when he naively repeats Mark's numerous mistakes without comment. Luke repeatedly gets facts about Paul wrong. I don't quite get what he's saying there. How do we know facts about Paul? I mean, maybe from reading the Paul epistles, but that means that we're trusting Paul. I would absolutely maintain that Paul never existed either. But even if he did, I would say that he would be very close to something like a Roman intelligence agent. But I really just think that he was also part of the plot, part of the psyop, and that the epistles of Paul were actually written by Pliny the Younger, who was a friend, very close friend and relative of the Roman royals, and lived at the court, at Caesar's palace and so on. But Luke is also often contradicting things that are written in the epistles. Acts 9:26, shown by Paul to be false in his accounts in Galatians 1 and 2. That's not, to me, of any consequence. I think all of them are false and all of them are fiction. And so, getting them to agree or disagree just shows that none of them are real, not that one is more accurate than the other. But because Luke makes so many mistakes, he probably, sides on the side of John being the one who's telling the truth. Okay, the trial and death of Jesus. His verdict is harsh. Even where the Gospels do agree with each other on point after point, he finds that the Gospel writers get their facts wrong, sometimes ridiculously so. Neglecting Passover, meeting by night, holding trial in a private home, conducting a trial in secret, the high priest acting as interrogator himself, and even striking the defendant with his hand, the failure of the witnesses to agree, mocking and beating the prisoner, and many more, any of which should have resulted in a mistrial. Pontius Pilate also comes from an alternate reality. They unanimously portray him as a concerned but indecisive worrywart who can't bring himself to execute Jesus but is too weak to prevent it. But in reality, Pilate was a ruthless tyrant. But our explanation that Pilate is a ruthless tyrant comes from Josephus. So we don't know whether Pilate is a ruthless tyrant or not, because Josephus is just every bit as bound to lie or misrepresent the truth as the Gospels are. I personally believe that that Pilate probably actually existed. I don't think Josephus can go that far. There are other sources out there, but